I'm using these words correctly. Yeah. Zionism is a decolonization exercise. Hello, folks. Genocide is not resistance. Resistance is not genocide. There are circumstances which are resistance. There are circumstances which are genocide. Do not confuse the two. I will not go down that road.
Clip it up. Welcome back to
Ami's house.
With us today in studio, we are honored to have writer, commentator, speaker, and broadcaster, and another British intellectual, Melanie Phillips. We're on a roll.
In our series of British intellectuals, and Melanie just came out with a book.
Yes. Book is called
The Builder's Stone: how Jews and Christians built the West, and why only they can save it.
Yes, we're trying to bring the Jews and Christians back together because some people out there are trying to drive it apart.
They are.
And we can name names, and we will later. But before we do that, I find that in this conversation about the Arab-Zionist conflict, right, going back, and there's like three lanes here that kind of intersect at weird points. You have the Arab-Zionist conflict, you have the modern-day Israel-Gaza war, and then you have anti-Semitism in general. And they intersect at different points. But I find that when you're raised with the background of really hearing the Zionist perspective and that history, then you're met with a counter perspective later on, which is, call it the Palestinian perspective, the ideas of the Nakba, displacement, all those kinds of ideas. Because initially you're taught that it was this land without a people for a people without a land, a place where people can come to settle. Then you're met with this, oh no, they displaced all these people. But then if you dig beneath that, I find that you come around again to the other side of saying, wait a minute, this whole narrative is full of misleading distortions and information. So just to clean that up a little bit, a correction of the history.
Yeah.
Like, just give us the take as quickly as we can, just so we can bring us up to speed on what really happened, going back to the founding of the State of Israel or a little before that, and like which side between the Zionist side and the Arab side is more aligned with reality.
You're Zionism 101. Well, it's quite simple. The international community prior to the United Nations, it was then called the League of Nations in 1922, decided that the Jews and the Jews alone should be given the right to settle the land of what was then called Palestine as an administrative name. And that land consisted of what is now Israel, the State of Israel, the so-called West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and Gaza. And the Jews alone were given the legally binding right to settle there, and that right was given that duty to settle them was given to Britain as being the mandatory authority. Scroll forward. The Arabs of the time, who had by then become radicalized to what we now consider to be Islamism, political Islam, which hadn't been the case before the First World War, got going. And it became a religious war to stop the Jews from ever having a homeland in the land that was what we now know as Israel. Then there was tremendous fight, a great deal of terrorism, pogroms against the Jews, attacks against the British. The British decided to renege on their commitment to settle the Jews throughout the land, and instead offered the Arabs, who were bent on genocide, they offered them a great part of that land. The Jews agreed to separate the land. At all stages, the Jews have agreed to give away part of that land. The Arabs refused on the basis that they wanted to destroy Israel and destroy the Jewish homeland. The result was the State of Israel was declared in 1948, and there was a war of independence. Several Arab armies tried to destroy it. That's been basically the story ever since. The Arab or Muslim world has tried to eradicate the State of Israel. The West has chosen to view this not as a war of extermination against Israel, but as a conflict over the division of land between two peoples who were entitled to it. And consequently, if you have that sort of situation, the remedy is a compromise. You have to bash heads together and divide the land, except that that's the solution to a different problem. This was not a problem of two sets of people with a right to the land trying to lay claim to it. It's one set of people trying to exterminate another. And the Arab side, the Muslim side, has no rights to the land because it was then reconceived since they lost all the wars that they tried to launch against the Jewish homeland, now the State of Israel, after 1948. Yasser Arafat, then the leader of the terrorist Palestine Liberation Organization, went to the Soviet Union in the 1960s, around 1964 I think it was, and formulated the brilliant, it was an act of genius, the idea of reconfiguring the conflict entirely from being what was an Arab war of extermination against the Jewish homeland to a war of liberation by something called the Palestinian people, which never existed. And it came into existence solely in order to destroy the right to the land of the true indigenous people of the land, who were the Jews.
And what year was that again?
Oh, well, I would say 64, I think it was.
You said Palestinians as an identity, as separate from Arabs in the land.
Correct.
Was what didn't exist before.
Exactly.
So there were human beings that were Arab there.
Absolutely. When the international community issued its mandate for Palestine, Jews had already started to return. There had been a Jewish majority in Jerusalem from around the mid-19th century.
Under Ottoman Empire, there was a Jewish majority population
in Jerusalem, and there were always Jewish communities from the exile back in antiquity in places like Sfat and maybe other places. Right. But it was very, very sparsely populated, and of the sparse population, the majority in 1922 were Arab, but they considered themselves to be part of the Arab nation. They were what we would call now Bedouin. They were nomadic, and they considered themselves to be Syrian. At no stage did they consider themselves to be Palestinian. During the Palestine Mandate, Palestine was a kind of administrative name, which was originally given by the Romans in an attempt to eradicate the Jewish nature of Judea. The Palestinian adjective in those years between the First World War and 1948 applied solely to Jews. The Palestinians were the Jews. Palestinian, the Jewish National, I've forgotten what the acronyms were. The Palestine Post. I mean, the Palestinian was a term that described the Jews of the time. There were people, obviously, but there's a difference between people and a people. And people often wrongly quote this famous quote, a people without a land for a land without a people. And people wrongly quote it as a people without a land for a land without a people. Right. Nobody ever said there were no people there. What was not there was a people. Very, very different. The people, which was a people, was the Jews.
Was it the phrase "a land without a people" for a people without a land?
Yes.
Yeah.
The indefinite article was crucial.
So it's misleading because it's not a land without people. Right. It's not like it's empty.
Exactly. Nobody ever said it was empty.
Conceivably, those people could have been part of the new Israel people. They could have become part of the new people that moved in there.
The majority of people who were in the land in the 1920s were Arab. But they weren't a people in the sense that they were part of the Arab people, but they weren't a people from that particular area of land which was then administratively called Palestine.
So the question is, what's to be said to the argument where it didn't belong to anybody, but if there's people there, and then they say it wasn't the administrative body's land to give away, and therefore by trying to create a partition for a Jewish state, what's the response to that?
Well, if one's saying that these were all this was an artificial creation, that's true. It was, post First World War carve up by the great powers. But then you have to say that places like Iraq are completely illegitimate, or Lebanon or Syria. I mean, Israel is an ancient nation, and that was the place where it was an ancient nation. The Jews are the only people for whom that land was ever their national kingdom. And that's why the international community said, they should be returned to that area.
So, and then what happened in 1948 when were those people who lived there given a chance to become Israeli?
You mean when the war happened?
Yeah, the Arabs who were living there.
Because it all rests on this thing that displacement happened because of settlers, or it happened because of war.
No,
that might be a simple question, but I really
it happened
don't
because
know.
of war.
Yeah.
I mean, the most authoritative histories tell you that I think it was 5 Arab armies, there may be more, but basically 5 Arab armies declared war against a war of extermination against the nascent state of Israel. And there is documented and recorded evidence that the leadership, the Zionist leadership of the time, said to the indigenous Arabs, that is to say the Arabs who were living there at the time, don't go. And the Arab states said, go. They issued a kind of instruction, go so that you'll be safe, and when we win, you'll come back. And so they went. And not all of them went. Some of them stayed. But the ones who went largely because they were being advised to leave the theatre of war, and then they would come back. And of course they didn't. They weren't able to come back because they lost the war. Now, normally when people wage a war of extermination and lose, the world doesn't say, oh, we have a duty and a responsibility, and it's our moral requirement to tell those people who waged a war of extermination that they have a right to come back. Nobody's ever said that, except on this occasion, where the whole notion of who were refugees was artificially created for one place only, which was Israel, in order to create refugees whose status as refugees would be passed down from generation to generation. That's literally nowhere else in the world does that happen. And it was done for one reason only, to create a set of people who would literally expand and expand and expand in order that they should be the way in which Israel would be destroyed. I mean, it's as ridiculous to say they are refugees as to say that I am a refugee because my grandparents and great-grandparents came from Poland and Russia.
Now, don't you think even Israel itself conceded to that responsibility far too often? To be responsible for, like, Israel in a way pays for it not being willing to do what it had to do in those times. We're left with these problems of demographics.
Yeah.
Where, fast forward to 67, for example, you're trying to make this case for Israel, but at the same time, in 67, just like it's normal for populations to move after a war of aggression they started, like, say, into Jordan,
Yes.
why not Israel properly annex the West Bank and make it part of Israel as opposed to this hodgepodge? And now you're left with a whole problem because you're trying to have your cake and eat it too.
Well, I think there are a number of reasons for that I can think of, although I don't really know the answer to your question. But one reason is that the founding fathers of Israel, of the State of Israel, notwithstanding what I just said about there never being a Palestinian people and so on and so forth, and they didn't think about a Palestinian people, but they thought about people who had been displaced through war, and they felt guilty, they felt responsible. Even though it wasn't their fault, and even though it was a war of extermination, they felt a sense of responsibility.
And kinship, maybe?
Yes, absolutely. I'm sure that was part of it. And
it's an ethic that plagues them till this day.
Yes, yes. And also, then subsequently, every prime minister, every government of the State of Israel has had to dance to the tune of the West, because it is a client state, it's a dependent state, it's basically been very vulnerable. It's still vulnerable, even though it now has military power and so on. It's still vulnerable. It's facing, a potential force of enemies who are exponentially, vastly more numerous. And so it's basically vulnerable. So it kind of depended upon the West. And the West, from the get-go, in fact, not from the get-go, from before the get-go, from the mid-1930s, when Britain reneged on its binding treaty obligation to settle the Jews throughout the land, ripped it up and proceeded to offer it to the aggressors, and has done so ever since.
Was there a specific name for the agreement?
There were. Which agreement?
That you're referring to, they had a binding agreement.
It was the mandate for Palestine.
Yeah. Okay.
And to this day, the British, having created this situation, which then was followed by other countries in the West, including America, all subscribed to this kind of mythological solution, which was the two-state solution. The two-state solution was offered in the 1930s and turned down on the basis that the agenda of the Arab side was extermination. And it still is. It hasn't changed. And the West is still flogging the dead horse and then blaming Israel for not willingly sacrificing itself, even though, actually, having said that, over the years, and it relates to your point that Israel has gone along with all this nonsense, Israel has turned itself inside out to accommodate this kind of thing. It's agreed to every two-state solution that's been offered at least 5 times, every Palestine state, and it's gone along with measures required by the international community in accordance with this false analysis of what this problem is, or what this conflict is all about. It's gone along with measures which have greatly impacted its own security, as a result of which a lot of Israelis, have died. So it's like, objectively crazy, and it's because Israel has never been able, or never felt able, to function as a properly independent, sovereign nation.
It's so interesting because it seems like, in an effort to remain less vulnerable, they make concessions to the West which make it more vulnerable in the actual neighborhood it's in.
Totally. But then, they have a very, very different worldview to virtually anybody else, and it comes out of the parlous situation they've been in since the start, which is that they, certainly until fairly recently, it may have changed, we can discuss that in the last 18 months, but before October 7, they were living very much from week to week, month to month, week to week, day to day. Are we going to survive this week, this month, today? And we don't think about anything else, So
survival mode.
Absolutely survival mode, which you can understand, but
up until October 7th.
You're saying this precedes October 7th?
Yes, I mean, so much has changed since October 7, because they've been in a state of war. It's quite a different situation.
Yeah.
No, well, I would have thought they felt more secure in 2021.
Before, more than now,
if
you
they felt
mean?
that way in 1950, I could understand that. But I'm surprised to hear you say they felt they were still week to week in 2020.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because look, they were under missile attack for years and years and years. Dozens and dozens of missiles coming every week, every day, every month, whatever it is. The population living in shelters in the south, nobody cared. No one in the West even noticed. The media in Britain never even reported it. All they've ever reported is for the Western media, or the British media. I can only really speak for the British media. The story in the Middle East kicks off, in their words, when Israel responds. Right. What's come before that is not reported. So when Israel responds, finally, to the missiles, Israel is the aggressor.
Right. Well, Israel's a victim of its own success in being secure and prosperous, because I think Western media, British media, has a fetish for seeing suffering and being able to signal that we're empathetic towards it. So when they don't see equal suffering on the Israeli side because Israel can stop rockets from landing, what's the point? What's the point in siding with Israel? I don't look good.
Yeah, but also
I don't
there's
look
something
like an empath.
That's absolutely right. But there's something deeper and darker, which is that
let's go there.
The orthodoxy of the sort of liberal establishment, leftist liberal establishment, which is at its fringes intersectionality. I say fringes, but it's actually quite mainstream. It holds that the world is divided. All relationships are divided divided on power lines. It's basically a Marxist formulation, although most people who think like this don't think of themselves as Marxists, but put that to one side. It comes from Marx. Every single relationship is a matter of power. So either you are powerful or powerless. If you're powerful, you cannot do right. If you're powerless, you cannot do wrong. If you're powerful, you are an oppressor. If you're an oppressor, you cannot be a victim. If you are powerless, you are a victim, and therefore anything you do, however bad, however many people you murder, it's not your fault. It's the fault of the oppressor, because you have to do this because you're oppressed. And Israel has been put in the position, has been placed in the category of oppressor. Why? First of all, because it's kind of Western. Is it? Okay, well, it's Western a bit. Secondly, it's white. Well, no, it's not. The majority are brown or black-skinned. The majority of Jews, a small majority of Jews, are brown-skinned. Okay, but nevertheless, it's considered to be Whites, because it's oppressive, because it's powerful. Why is it powerful? Because it's got military might. And military might's being provided for it by America, and America is the acme of powerfulness, right? So Israel is powerful. As if that's not bad enough, there's something darker and deeper going on here among liberal leftist opinion, which is that intersectionality holds that Jews cannot be oppressors. Forget Israel for a minute. Jews cannot be the oppressed. Jews cannot be victims. Why? I mean, Jews are the quintessential victims. None has been more victimized than the Jews over history. Okay. And Jews are like microscopic in terms of the number of Jews in the West and in the world generally. Statistically, almost insignificant. But no, Jews cannot be victims. And Jews are not the oppressed. They are the oppressor. Why? Because we all know Jews run everything. They run the finance. They run the media. They run the law. They run public affairs, and they are visible everywhere, and they run everything, and they basically form a kind of force behind the scenes which manipulates events to their advantage, to the disadvantage of everybody else. This is barking mad. And it's classical anti-Semitism.
And that's not what the left says, though.
Absolutely.
That's the right.
No. It's what the left says. This is at the root of intersectionality, why Jews cannot ever be the oppressed, because they run everything. So at the heart of intersectionality, at the heart of left-wing orthodoxy, is pure anti-Semitism.
Do they have a different phrasing for it?
They
than
must.
The Jews run everything?
A packaging.
Yeah, that sounds more conspiratorial.
The right wing is very honest
nutty.
about that. They'll say that. The left does it in a very different way. Well, they'll say maybe a successful minority. That's the problem, because it dispels this notion that, you know, if you're a minority, you must therefore be oppressed by the system that we're claiming is oppressive. They dispel that. So what's the language they would use on the left?
Well, it comes out in all kinds of ways. It came out, for example, in the Iraq War. Neocons was a code for Jews. Everybody knew the Jews were responsible for the Iraq War. The Jews were responsible because they were manipulating George W. Bush into going into war because they wanted to run the world. In my personal experience, that was on left and right, in those terms. So now it's more that you hear it among intersectional groups, black groups, gay groups, whatever. You know, Jews, you know, it's ludicrous to think that Jews can be victims. I mean, Jews are so powerful.
You hear it. You hear it with AIPAC. They talk about it in terms of AIPAC. Oh, AIPAC's running our politics, or AIPAC's is controlling our media.
Right. Okay. Fine. So
they'll put it into institutional phraseology, it's not Jewish
systemic,
people. It's all the organizations that involve Jews. I don't hate Jews. I just love those who hate Jews.
Yeah. So on the left, it's not, you know, I love Jews and my best friends are Jews, but I just hate Israel, and that's got nothing to do. One's got nothing to do with the other, but it is anti-Jew because it's the, you know, Israel is the only. There's no other people, country, or cause which is to the target of this kind of madness of not just misrepresentation, but a complete inversion of truth and lies. But it is laundered on the left, whereas on the right, as you're saying, it's not laundered. It's out there.
It's a little easier to showcase because it's not masked and color-coded and intellectual drivel, whatever. Right. Well, so let's skip ahead for a second into the conversation about this, what you're talking about. I know that people watching this are going to say, did you just say neocon is code for Jew too? And this conversation about anti-Zionism being anti-Semitism. Yeah. I believe that, and I think that's demonstrable, but sometimes it takes a Natasha and a Douglas and a Monk debate to unpack it and be persuasive. And I fear that the externality of that in the conversation and the dialogue here is that a lot of people coming out of woke madness are hearing these two things juxtaposed together and are just rolling their eyes like, what do you mean we can't talk about Israel, can't criticize the government, we can't ask questions about why particular Jews are overrepresented in certain industries and just be curious because we're just going to be called hateful, just like the left called everything racist, and therefore you can't even talk about math without being called a racist. I don't want this conversation to fall victim to that, and I fear that even though I agree with that conclusion, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are linked and are similar. When people hear that, with the way that when we talk about a movable middle, that's just hearing these conversations for the first time, they're seeing that fall into the same category. And I wonder if there's just a different vocabulary to talk about this.
Well, I agree. The word anti-Semitism, has put it mildly, got a bad press in terms of the claim of anti-Semitism having got a bad press. The people who roll their eyes, for sure, have absolutely no idea of the lies to which they have been indoctrinated over many generations now, and which they believe to be axiomatically true. They have absolutely no idea of the big lies about, as I said before, Palestinianism having been invented to destroy Jewish identity in the land. They have no idea that the Jews are the indigenous people of the land. They have no idea that Israel behaves in accordance with international law, not least because the Jews don't tell them for all kinds of reasons. But there's something more than that they don't realize. If they think that Israel is a colonialist enterprise, which many of these people basically do, then it follows not only that do they think, as they have often said, that anti-Semitism is a kind of is deployed as a shield by people like me, as a shield to sanitize, if I can mix my metaphor, to sanitize the crimes of Israel. It's much worse than that, because if it is true that Israel is a colonialist exercise, which they believe to be true, then anti-Semitism is not just a mischievously used shield. Anti-Semitism becomes a moral imperative. You have a duty to hate Jews, because Jews are colonizers. Jews are evil, and so you have a duty. If you believe that the Jewish homeland is not a homeland, is a colonialist enterprise which has caused the expulsion of people who are the true indigenous people of the land, then any Jew who supports that is evil.
Who supports that? They'll make that on the left. They very clearly, because otherwise it undermines their whole premise. They will say Zionist, and they will love the Jews. The biggest anti-Zionists are Jews. They will love putting them forward to say, "See, we're not as cover."
But they never stop at Zionist Jews. They never inquire whether you're a Zionist. They assume, because they hold all Jews collectively responsible, and that is anti-Semitism. So at every stage, they're actually showing that they are sort of anti-Semites. But the point is this: that we're dealing here with a kind of not just a departure from reason, but a kind of inversion of reason, which is kind of fried everyone's brains. You can't even talk about it.
Yeah.
But I remember even before. I mean, I'm a different generation from you.
42, whatever. Yeah.
So my
2 years of age.
my personal experience goes back quite a long way, and I remember before the whole intersectionality was invented, we never heard that phrase like in the early 1980s. And in the early 1980s, when I first became aware of this, and so it was also the case, I would say, certainly from mid to late 70s, you couldn't use the phrase you couldn't use the word anti-Semitism, because it was just it wasn't so much shielding the crimes of Israel as being the Jews trying to claim a status for themselves as victims, which is really they have no right to make that claim, because there's nothing particularly unusual about Jewish victimhood. It's not a thing. They are just using it to cover up what? Well, they're just so awful. They're just awful people. So even then, it was, anti-Semitism was, you couldn't mention the word, because if you talked about anti-Semitism, then you were a Jew trying to get some sort of advantage, as Jews do,
free from scrutiny and
So right from then, it was fun. It was the opposition to the term anti-Semitism was very pronounced. I felt it. I wouldn't use the term. And behind that was the belief that, it's being used by Jews like you just to sort of pretend that you're not as awful as you actually are, because we know you are. I felt that very acutely, and that was before intersectionality and anti-colonialism and all that stuff.
So the analysis is interesting, but one thing I want to try to be discerning about is like muddling up the two different sources that we're seeing right now. Because now you're not only seeing it, we've known for a long time what's going on campus, what's going on with these people who see Israel as a Western outpost and America, and they hate it all. You know, so flaunting the prosperity of Israel is going to offend them, and they're pro-censorship and pro-regulating speech and all that. But on the right, when you're seeing this hostility, it's because they see the pro-Israel side as trying to do that very thing, regulating speech, feeling like you're the woke ones, that we can't ask questions about this, just asking questions. And I just don't want to take the bait on that kind of thing, because in their scenario, they will see this anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism game as simply a way to shut down criticism or simply a way to shut down debate.
I don't care what they think.
I love it.
They can all go and do the other thing.
Yes.
Why should I have to adapt what I'm saying to you or to anybody else in accordance with what these repellent people are saying, the lies that they're telling themselves? I mean, I'm happy to unpack it for them. If they want some psychological counseling, I'll give it to them. But I'm not going to start trying to try and pretend, or not pretend, trying to put forward a point of view which might possibly encourage them not to be so dreadful. They're going to be dreadful. They are dreadful. We have to understand what we're up against. We're up against people who turn language and morality inside out, and we just have to stand up and say the truth. This is Jew hatred. You are not progressive. You're on the side of Jew hatred. Not only that, if you're supporting the Palestinian, so-called Palestinian people and the Palestinian cause, you are in support of genocide and ethnic cleansing. How dare you pretend to a moral sense? How dare you say you are progressive? I call you out as bogus, not just a hypocrite, but a liar. That's what we should be saying to these people.
100%.
Do you think that would be effective?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I want to. So
Wait.
Yeah,
Why? Because I think it would cause pushback.
No. Yes.
Tell me. Yeah.
No.
I wanna hear
Yes.
no Jewish. No yes.
Our side, the defenders of Jews, Israel, and righteousness and justice and truth. Fine. We've been adopting a strategy which is completely the wrong strategy. We play defence.
Right.
Once you play defence, you're on the territory that has on territory defined by the enemy, and you've had it. We should be going on to the attack. We should be going on to the front foot. Now, how do we do that? Many ways, but one way is this: we have to understand the Achilles heel of these people who are telling these lies. Okay, why is the left so besotted by this cause that it literally runs out the room, won't go into the room, has to shut down the argument? And I mean, I worked for The Guardian for 20 years. I was part of them for part of that time. I think I understand how the mindset works. The mindset works like this. If I'm a left-wing person, I'm a left-wing person because I'm moral and decent. I'm moral and decent, and therefore I'm a left-wing person. What does that mean? Well, as a left-wing person, I believe in great things. I believe in compassion and in justice and standing up against abuses of power and against all prejudice and bigotry and for people living together and for coming together. I agree with all those things, okay? But this is how the leftist thinks. The leftist thinks that because I believe in these things, I therefore support these various causes. One of the causes is the Palestinian people. For various reasons, which we need not go into, I believe as a left-wing person that the Palestinian people are among the most oppressed of the earth, and they've been oppressed by the Israelis, who are colonialist oppressors, blah, blah, blah. Fine, right? I'm a moral person. Here is my Palestinian support badge that shows everybody, including me, that I'm a moral person. October 7 happens, and the left-wing person goes, what happened here? What? I'm being told that the people I support as victims of the Israelis, that they did what? They raped and they beheaded and they slaughtered and they tortured and they dismembered children in front of their parents. No, that can't possibly be, because these people are the oppressed and couldn't do that, and these people are the oppressors. And if it were true that this happened, what does that make me? It makes me a really bad person. So we saw the phenomenon that feminists, Me Too feminists, said, we don't believe this. Didn't happen. And the people who said, okay, so maybe some bad things did happen that day, but it's Israel's fault. Okay, so they turn it so that their narrative...
Israel did it to themselves, really.
Right. Now, why? Because it is imperative.
And I picked the right villain still, and I can stay consistent in my virtue.
Because otherwise, if I were to think that what Melanie is saying, even part of it is true, my whole moral and political personality would fragment and shatter. I would no longer be moral. What would I be? What would I be? I hear this the whole time. What am I now? Oh my goodness! I'm becoming right-wing, and therefore evil. They can't have that.
And I've ripped posters down of children.
This is their Achilles heel.
Okay.
So we have to do to them what they do to us, but with truth on our side rather than lies.
Okay.
They hang labels round our neck saying terrible things, calling us terrible things. We have to hang the label round their neck on the basis of truth. You are not progressive. You are not moral. You are supporting unconscionable things. You are supporting tyranny, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and so on.
But if the events of October 7th, seeing the images of that reality, didn't cause them to question themselves, what would us yelling at them cause? How would that cause
humiliation
them to question
and shame?
Okay.
Public humiliation and shame. They can't bear it.
Oh, I actually completely agree with you as the indictment of the left, right? Because these are the progressives we're talking about. So fast forward 18 months, what surprised me, a lot of progressive readers were surprised to see what went on campus. I wasn't. But what surprised me is now you have factions who normally you could say would be pro-military, pro-prosperity, pro-Western, supposedly, also turning on Israel. And maybe there's some PTSD of American foreign policy that they're kind of wrapping it around. But let's get a little concrete here, for example. When I look at the last 18 months since the 7th and seeing where people started who didn't know anything about this versus where it's going. For example, you look at someone like a Joe Rogan who's asking questions like...
Do I have to?
Well, he's not bad to look at.
His head is very shiny. But they're looking at the situation, and in the beginning they saw this. They're like, oh my God, that's crazy. And then after 18 months of, you could say it's an effective propaganda campaign of the onslaught of images coming out of Gaza, people are saying, just a reasonable question, which I don't fault them for having no prior knowledge to this, and don't understand the suicidality mentality of a Yahya Sinwar. We take for granted what we know about the culture, but they don't. So they're just going, I don't know, it just seems like a genocide, or it seems like excessive. Does Israel have to do it this way? Coming from an empathetic place, not coming from a hateful, anti-Western, want Israel destroyed place. So when people see those reasonable questions come up and they're met with anti-Semitism, they're met with reactionary movements on our side, understandably because it's sensitive, that they're giving in to these talking points of genocide, apartheid, because it's coming more from a place of ignorance or just seeing an onslaught of images.
Right.
How do we address that? What's the vocabulary for that?
Well, I mean, I don't think...
It's not shame, I don't think.
Well, first of all, I don't think one should... I mean, we've been talking about anti-Semitism because I think that's at the core of it. But nevertheless, I try not to use that word because it's, first of all, it takes you down terrible blind alleys. And secondly, it's not really the point. As you say, people of goodwill... exposed to what they've been exposed to over the last 18 months, with Israel making such a terrible fist, as usual, of putting its own case. And with, certainly in Britain, I mean, it's omnipresent, wall-to-wall coverage, which presents Israel as the aggressor by omitting what it's up against and by treating the Hamas narrative as credible and true. And the whole, everything is framed in that way. So a person of goodwill just has no understanding of that there is another side, let alone that the side that they're being told is true is actually completely false. So what we have to do is just knuckle down and continue to put out there in the way that we can, everywhere we can, what the truth is. So, you know, to say that why Israel is actually, in terms of the war in Gaza, even by the Hamas's own figures, Israel's record, or the ratio of civilians to combatants killed, is far, far better than anything ever achieved by any military on earth, including America and Britain. And even the Hamas now says our figures were completely wrong, and no media outlet has really accepted that.
They had a come to Jesus moment where, like, let's be honest about the stats here.
And also, one has to point out that, as far as I'm aware, certainly in Britain this is true, no media outlet has ever said in every single report that they publish or broadcast which contains reporting from Gaza, nobody has ever said these reports are constructed under threat from the Hamas. Every journalist knows if you don't toe the line, at the very best, you will not be allowed in, and at the worst, we will kill you. Everybody knows that. They've known that for years. Every news desk knows this. Every reporter knows this. Nobody ever says it.
I remember the hospital tour that the journalist did. It was a British journalist a couple of years ago, and he says, well, we're told we're not allowed to go there because, okay, I'm seeing somebody look at me. I'm going to turn now here because in there, in the MRI machine right underneath, there's a whole rocket cache, and he's not allowed to go there. And there may be, like, and he does this whole tour, and you can hear it in his voice. So, okay, so I'm being told, I'm being clearly instructed, a Hamas operative just walked by me, and he's in the hospital. And so there are these hints of it. But how come when they get back to the West, how come these Doctors Without Borders are coming? What is to say, like, they're having this effect of garnering the empathy and sympathy of the world turned, weaponized against Israel, and they're not in the Gaza Strip once they come back and they're reporting these things, you know. Because part of it is, I think also Israel gets out there and tries to present itself as Hamas is totally responsible for this death and destruction, and yet we are, and then they're bragging about how they're taking ownership and responsibility for the well-being at the same time. So it seems to me they sometimes undermine their own. Well,
they do.
It's like war. If this is what a just war looks like, because nobody wants this. You know, you're kind of, it's a Western game they try to play.
Israel doesn't do itself any favors by the way it presents itself, but it's the duty of all of us just to plow on and say these are the facts, that Israel goes to these lengths and does these things to avoid civilian casualties. It's war. There are going to be civilians who are killed. This is always tragic. But nevertheless, you compare what Israel is doing to any other military, and it's doing far, far more to try and avoid civilian casualties. There's no alternative, it seems to me, but to continue to hammer away at the facts that are known.
So let's answer a question that Joe Rogan specifically asked, that you mentioned, that I think is a reasonable question for someone who doesn't have the background that we have, which is there really no other way to get to the hostages than going through 50,000 civilians?
Of course there's another way.
Can't you do it through negotiations?
No,
through
of course there's another way.
Yeah, so let's answer it, because let's answer this
On
question.
October the 8th, America should have said to Qatar, unless every hostage is returned in 24 hours unharmed, you're out of here. We take away our air base or naval base, whatever it is, they're in Qatar, whatever, they have army base. We will no longer treat you as anything other than a rogue state. You are Hamas. You are Hamas. You release them. Instead, we've had this farce for 18 months in which America and Israel insisted on treating Hamas as a genuine interlocutor, people acting in good faith. And today we're having this madness that Qatar is like being heroized. You know, Qatar, we're told, was responsible, and we're supposed to be basically saying hosannas to it for the release, thank goodness he was released, of Eden Alexander. If Qatar can just say he's out, why couldn't they have said that with the 240 others on day one? This is how it could have been changed.
Always missing the pressure points. They're always missing where the pressure should be.
In the absence of major geopolitical players using all their leverage against the Iran and Qatar, the only other option is to go in militarily, because negotiations won't work.
But the choice is theirs.
The choice is whose?
The Qataris.
I see.
In other words, if you don't want this death and destruction, we don't have to impose it. The choice is yours, and it's never been presented that way because Biden was president. And what did why did you do that? That's what he said.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, Israel is, you know, for various reasons, I think to do with the feeling that they were so intensely vulnerable. They went along with all this rubbish, a lot of this rubbish, including the stuff about Qatar. I mean, I don't know what the truth of all that is in terms of Israel's just relationship with the Arab world and quite why they've gone along with it. But it was there was another way. But as you say, in the absence of that fundamental restructuring.
It can't be done between Israel and Hamas around a table.
How else can it be done?
Correct.
The idea that you can negotiate,
asking,
the idea you can negotiate, the idea you can negotiate with an agenda which is non-negotiable, which is basically what fanatical jihadi Islam is.
Yeah.
If you negotiate on that basis, then negotiation is immediately and automatically and irreversibly an act of appeasement or surrender. There's no two ways about it. They've got you, and they will use it. So there's no other way than war, unfortunately.
And that was just not illuminated.
And the war looks this way because of all the obvious things with the booby traps and
the war looks this
whatnot.
way because in a uniquely infernal way, the strategy of the Hamas is to use its own population not just as human shields, but as cannon fodder, so that they will die in large number, so that the West will turn against Israel.
And it works.
And it works.
Right.
That's the strategy, and Israel knows that perfectly well. But because it is literally up against the wall, what's he going to do otherwise? It's going to sit there and wait while America does what it, does this endless negotiation. And meanwhile, Hamas, which has said, we will do October 7 again and again until you are obliterated. And behind Hamas, it's not Hamas, it's Iran on a seven-front, if you have a seven-front pincer movement. What are they supposed to do?
Yeah.
They have to go to war.
Yeah. That's a good answer.
Thank you.
I don't want to run out of time, and I want to get to your book, but I also just want to take on, in the interest of sticking to the facts, some of the best opposing arguments that I don't think ever get addressed as head-on as I'd like to hear. So I'd like to put this to you as a little exercise, because oftentimes when there's this exhausting moral equivalence that happens when we talk about Hamas and how barbaric they are and try to illuminate that. You're always told, well, the IDF kills more, or they bring up the historical story of Israel and claim that Israeli terrorists were the ones who bombed the King David to drive out an occupying force, and they try to point to it as if there's this glaring hypocrisy.
Menachem Begin was a terrorist that now led the country.
Okay,
yeah. Let's just go back there for a minute, because it comes up in these conversations, and you see that, and I loved. Yeah. So give me the corrective.
We're exhausted also, but we don't hear a lot of good answers out there.
What particularly of these dreadful libels you want me to address?
Okay, let's talk about Israel. In its founding, had to drive out the British occupying force, and they talk about Lehi and Stern Gang and the
King David bombing.
And the King David is like, this is the counter argument. Listen, Hamas, you can't criticize them; they're absolved because Israel basically did the same thing to found itself.
So it's not the same situation at all. It's completely the diametrical opposite. Whether or not you approve of the Israeli terrorists, and they were terrorists, they were because they were using violence. For political ends. Okay, by that definition, they were terrorists. Okay, fine.
And targeting civilians, or
no, they weren't targeting civilians.
Well, there's controversy. There's controversy about this. The King David, they say they gave a warning. It didn't get through. It wasn't.
It was a British military headquarters.
Besides that, they also targeted British military.
It was the King David Hotel was not a hotel.
But
it was a British military headquarters.
When we talk about the definition of terrorism, oftentimes, and I
but
think
the fact is, there's a fundamental difference.
Yes.
The British had reneged on their binding commitment and were basically enabling, and if you read some histories, taking the side of, in other words, arming those bent on genocide against the Jews of then Palestine. And to that extent, that was indeed a heroic resistance movement. Whether or not you agree that it should have been using violence in the way that it was, there was a division at the time between the Haganah types, the Ben Gurion types, who said the Lehi types were completely wrong. But basically, the cause was a genuine resistance movement against an oppressive colonialist regime, which was on the side of or was going to enable a genocide to take place.
A regime that was actually colonialist
It's just-
and
Yes.
actually oppressive.
So
These
come
phrases
along-
have been so co-opted as to be
Yeah.
completely called into question. But just
No.
because it's not true in this case in characterizing Israel, doesn't mean
Language means
it's
something. The
inverted.
fact it's being hijacked by
No, I
people
know.
does not. I'm not prepared to have it hijacked.
Right.
That's why
I'm
we
using
laugh.
these words correctly. Zionism
Do it,
is
Melanie.
is a decolonization exercise, right? And what the Hamas is doing is not against colonial oppressors. Hamas is a genocidal organization designed to wipe out Jews everywhere and destroy the state of Israel. There is no way on earth in any moral universe that can conceivably be considered to be a resistance movement. It is a genocidal movement. Hello, folks. Genocide is not resistance. Resistance is not genocide. There are circumstances which are resistance. There are circumstances which are genocide. Do not confuse the two. I will not go down that road.
Clip
All
it
right.
up. Very good.
Thank you.
Let's move on to the next one. This is a good argument, but I'm curious where it's flawed. Oftentimes we talk about, how to resolve this, and people will point to, hey, Israel made peace treaties with Jordan and Egypt. So why can't the same approach be applied to the Palestinians?
Oh, dear. One obvious reason is that the Palestinians don't want that approach.
That's for sure.
Jordan, for whatever reason, and Egypt, for whatever reason, did. Okay, we can all argue about whether this was a cold peace or a hot peace, and whether Egypt is still vile and whether Jordan is still troubling. That's not the point. They made the peace because they wanted to. The so-called Palestinians have been offered endless opportunities to make the peace and have always not only refused, but used it to step up genocidal war. Don't ask the Israelis why the peace hasn't been made. Ask the Palestinian Arabs why they haven't. And the answer is, my cynical way, first of all, they want to eradicate Israel, so they don't want a peace treaty at all. But secondly, why should they? Because every time it's offered to them, and every time they ramp up the war, the West becomes more and more inclined to give them more and more of what they want, and more inclined to dump on Israel. So they're on a good thing here. All they have to do is refuse, and they get more goodies.
It's like a capitalist argument. They make more money the more they refuse.
It's incentives.
It's easy to understand even if you're American.
Right. Right.
Yeah, to the extent that you increase the violence, turn up the intifada, and reject
Yeah.
the peace, you get more international aid and attention and sympathy.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. Well, that's a good one. Couple quick lightning round questions.
Oh dear. I feel like I'm in a quiz show.
We're off on the arguments now. But this has come up before in an interview. But Christopher Hitchens, no longer
yes.
with us. You're familiar, of course, as someone who you talked about Islamo-Nazism, as Islamofascism.
He invented the term, I think.
He invented it. What do you think he would say in a post-October 7th world, being famously anti-Zionist or pro-Palestinian or sympathetic to the cause today?
That's a good point. I think he would take my view.
Yeah, he'd be red-pilled.
Broadly.
Red-pilled.
Broadly. Yeah, he was almost there. I mean, he had this problem with Israel, okay, but he would have got over that because he understood the fundamentals of the Islamic war against civilization. He understood that, and he would have seen it, and he would have seen all the bullshit that's being talked, and he would have called it out. And my goodness, we miss his voice.
Yeah.
Because it was very powerful.
I've heard from people who've said that he had friends on the pro-Palestinian side early on in his early left career.
Oh, yes.
And friendship can be a corrupting force, and if you have too many friends on, it sort of can cloud your judgment even on a particular issue, and you just don't address it anymore.
Yeah,
but
but
who knows?
he was on a journey. When he died, he was on a journey.
Yeah.
I'm very partial to people who are on journeys, provided it's going from
Yes.
the wrong place to the right place, as opposed to the other way around.
Sure.
With the time we have left, do we
Yes.
want to talk quickly about Melanie's book and how it
Oh,
relates
yes,
a little
talk
bit
about
to
my book,
Tucker
please.
and Candace and everything?
Sure. So, your book,
The Builder's Stone.
Builder's Stone, How Christians and Jews...
Built the West,
Built
and
the
why
West.
only they can save it.
Yes, let's bring the Christians and Jews back together. How do we do that?
Well, look, I have written for many, many decades about what I perceive to be the self-destructive war against the West waged by Western elites, who basically decided long time ago, that the West was born in the original sins of colonialism, racism, and all the rest of it, and above all, whiteness, and therefore. And the Western nation state was the source, because it was a repository of all these terrible values. The Western nation state was the cause of division and war and tyranny. And so you have to basically take an axe to all of that and replace it with what I would call universalism. Transnational institutions like the UN, the International Criminal Court, these were sainted institutions, could do no wrong because they represented the brotherhood of man, as opposed to the nation state, division and war. Fine. And as a result, they took a wrecking ball to all the core values and institutions of Western civilization. I charted this over many decades: assault on the traditional family, assault on the education system, assault on the idea of the nation, the arrival of multiculturalism, which is not being nice to other people. It means that you can't say the West is better than any other culture. The arrival of Islamization, which understood the vacuum that had been developed. Right. And it gradually occurred to me that this was not unrelated to the onslaught that was going on over all these decades on Israel and the Jews through anti-Semitism and through the reversal of truth and lies over Israel and the Arab war against Israel, that these were actually part of the same story, and that it wasn't a surprise that Israel and the Jews were getting in the neck from a culture which was turning on itself to such an extent that it was, because at the root of the culture were values which we all know Christianity is the foundational creed of the West, but Christianity didn't come from nowhere. Christianity came from Judaism. And the values that are fundamental to civilized values that we all, people of all religions and none, subscribe to in the West, we hold dear, are basically Jewish values. Having decided that, I then decided that actually the West was going to hell in a handcart. Could it survive? Didn't it want to survive? I didn't know. But if it did want to survive, then the Jews could actually help, because the Jews do cultural survival, and we could show how a culture is kept on the road, how you keep a cultural show on the road. And guess what? We've got all your values. So I set to write my book, and that's where I got to on October the 6th, 2023. On October the 8th, I observed what we've been talking about, this appalling reaction. And I realized instantly that what I was seeing post-October 7, in terms of the West's reaction to October 7, was simply the repudiation of conscience, justice, and rationality. And this was precisely the conclusion I'd come to, that the West was doing to itself through its intelligentsia, through this onslaught. It had destroyed its own understanding of conscience, justice, and reason itself, rationality. And that you couldn't understand the onslaught on Jews and Israel unless you understood what the West was doing to itself. And you couldn't understand what the West was doing to itself unless you understood that at the heart of the West was Judaism and the Jewish people. And so I reframed what I was writing to present my analysis in terms of October 7 and its aftermath. And I also decided that, the Jews actually have a great deal to offer. You could actually save the West if the West wants to be saved, and the Jews have the secret source of cultural resilience, because that's what the Jews do. They survive, and so my last chapter of the book is a kind of 10-point program in which I've said that in every single grouping, culture, ethnicity, whatever, religion, and people of no religion in the West, there are people who understand that the West has uniquely wonderful values and wants them to survive and wants to defend them. And from all of those cultures and groups, there are people who want the opposite. And what I'm saying in the book is that I would like to see what I call a countercultural resistance movement formed of all those people from all those groupings and ethnicities and religions who support the West and understand what the West is, to come together and in various ways, which I kind of try to elaborate, can get together and save the West. And in this, I have put center stage the relationship between Jews and Christians. I think everybody, people of no religion, Muslims, agnostics, Zoroastrians, men, women, black, white, they all have a part to play in this. But because Christianity is fundamental to the West, and because Judaism is fundamental to those values of Christianity, Jews and Christians have a leading role in this. But they need to make common cause in helping lead this notional alliance. But to do so, both Jews and Christians have got to get over it with relation to each other. They've both got hang-ups about each other, and they've got to get over it and come together in common cause. Big ask, not easy, but in terms of people saying,
the Jesus thing.
Okay, but indeed. I mean, as I often say to my Christian friends, Jesus was a Jew. Right. Okay, but in terms of so it's a big ask, but there are people who say, first of all, you know, they have no idea about any of this, and secondly, there are people who do have an idea and who say, well, it's all over. I mean, you can't possibly pull the West back. To which I say, no, you can. Does it want to? Is it possible? I don't know whether it can be done, but if they want to, then I think you certainly can. But this is where you have to do it, and these are the bullets that have to be bitten in order to do so.
Jews are not the problem; we're the solution.
Exactly.
So
that's the builder's stone. You know where the builder's stone comes from?
I don't. Actually.
It's a phrase.
No, go ahead.
It's a phrase from the Psalms, Psalm 118.
Yeah.
And the relevant phrase is the stone that the builders have thrown out is the cornerstone.
Even masu habonim.
Correct.
There
Thank
it
you.
is.
And that's the point. Jews and Israel are disdained and being thrown out. They are the secret source for Western survival.
And I think it's a very important thing, because the natural reaction for too long has been that Jews are called the problem and they just go like this.
Exactly.
Rather than saying, we're the solution.
Exactly.
As opposed to owning a certain role, they sort of try to shy away from the criticism. No, don't call us that. Whatever it takes to make you happy. Let's do some more PR. Let's show you whatever, as opposed to like stepping into a role and playing offense.
I like that combined, and we can end here. I like that combined with your method of shame and humiliation to say look at us as an example, and we will tell you the truth.
Yeah,
because we know it.
Yeah, and not look at us as an example because we're better than you. Look at us as an example of how you survive. Because how you survive is you've got to love yourselves, you've got to love your culture, and that's why the Jews have survived, because it's worth surviving, because we believe our culture has produced these wonderful things, and you too, West, can believe that, because guess what? Most of your values that you hold dear, you got from us. And we're not saying that to be boastful or to convert people to religion or anything like that. We're doing it because this is the way you can keep the cultural show on the road and stop it, to mix my metaphor again, going off the edge of the cliff.
Yeah. And preserve. And when you shine a light, those who have been shameful are ashamed because they're revealed. It's this illumination. And those who need to see it, I think it's like a deep thing. But, you know, I think that's what the truth can hurt, and it can also save us. Melanie Phillips, wow. That was really excellent. Thank you so much for joining us here at Ami's house.
Thank
Book's
you.
coming out when?
It's come out.
It's come out.
You mean you
It's
haven't
out?
read it?
I'm so sorry.
It was published.
Myself.
It was published in America in mid-January.
Where's the best place to get it?
Amazon.
Amazon.
Okay.
Okay.
We'll put a link in the show.
Pick it up
that'd be
now.
nice.
I've already read it, and it's amazing. Melanie Phillips, thank you so much.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks for coming.
Real pleasure.